Chapter 4. The Wheels Begin to Turn. While Americans were busy shaping up a new kind of nation on this side of the world in Europe, and especially in England, something was going on that turned out to be a great deal more important than the war against the king or any other war. Perhaps something is the wrong word. It was a great many things, thousands of things, each of which, taken by itself, didn't amount to much, but when they were added up, they changed nearly everything in the world, much more than war had changed anything. This large number of little things all taken together made the great thing that we call the Industrial Revolution. It is not a very good name because industrial usually means having to do with the business of making goods, and this went much beyond that. Then revolution usually means rising up against the government and overthrowing it, but this affair wasn't aimed at any government. Yet although Industrial Revolution is a poor name, it is the best that anybody has been able to suggest. It is impossible to say exactly when the Industrial Revolution began or exactly how long it lasted. But we usually say that it began about 1750 and lasted about 100 years. There is a story that it began when a small boy in Scotland sat in the kitchen watching his grandmother's tea kettle come to a boil. That is only partly true, because a great many other things helped it along, but it is quite true. The small boy did get an idea from watching the tea kettle, and when he became a man, he did do a great deal to change the world. The boy's name was James Watt, and the idea was the use of a steam to drive machines. James noticed that when the kettle of cold water was put on the fire, the lid sat down flat. When the water started to boil, the lid began to bop up and down. Something was pushing it, and he wondered if there was any way to catch that force and to use it. A great many other people had wondered about the same thing. As far back as 1500 years before James Watt was born, a Greek thinker named Hero, who lived in Alexandria in Egypt, not only wondered about it, but he showed that it could be done. Here is a picture of James Watt looking at the tea kettle. This hero of Alexandria actually made a steam engine that would work, not very well, but after a fashion. Hero wasn't really interested, though. He made the thing as a sort of a toy, and after he died, it was forgotten. James Watt was interested. As he grew up, he kept thinking about it, and when he became a man, he drew designs which he took to the best machine maker in England, William Boulton. Together, they made a steam engine vastly better than Hero's and much better than those of any others who had tried to make one. You cannot begin to understand how important this was until you stop to think how things had always been done before. The fastest way of traveling was by riding horseback. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in Virginia, Washington wanted to get the news to Congress in Philadelphia as quickly as possible. So he sent one of his aides, Colonel Tench Tilghman, and Tilghman broke all records by getting to Philadelphia in 7 days. Congress was so impressed. It gave him a fine horse and a handsome sword as a reward for his speed. When George Washington wanted a sword, it was made exactly as swords had been made for Alexander the Great, who died 2,000 years before Washington was even born. Men beat the metal into shape with hammers, which meant that the greatest power applied at any one time was the power of a man's arm. And when the wheat on Washington's farm was ready to be harvested, well, it was cut by a worker with a small curved blade called a sickle, or a larger one called a scythe. It took much labor and much time to harvest a field that today's mowing machine could cut in a matter of minutes. The sickle and the scythe that Washington's field hands used were not much better than the tools used for harvesting wheat when the Bible story of Ruth, who gleaned in the field of Boaz, was written thousands of years ago. As long as it took a great deal of time and labor to raise even a little wheat, the farmer and his wife and children ate most of what was raised, and there was not much left to sell to people who lived in towns. So a great many people had to work on the land or there would be nothing for people who lived in the towns to buy. The towns and the cities could not grow very large because they had to get their food from the country nearby, and the country nearby could not produce enough food for many more people than the farmers themselves. Now, when the first census was taken in 1790, the largest city in the United States at the time was Philadelphia, and it had only 42,000 people. New Orleans existed, but it was not then in the United States, and it had less than 10,000 people. Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, San Francisco, and Los Angeles either did not exist at all or were merely small settlements in the wilderness. Nevertheless, many people liked to live in towns, and in Europe they crowded into London and Paris in greater numbers than the surrounding country could feed, with the result that a large part of the city people were dreadfully poor and hungry most of the time. Now, Thomas Jefferson saw this while he was in Europe as a minister to France, and he came back feeling that large cities were as bad for a country as a cancer is for a man's body. He hoped that there would never be a large city in America and that most of our people would always be farmers. The Industrial Revolution had already begun, but Jefferson had no idea what it was going to do in the next 50 years, for it moved slowly for a long time. First, Watt and Boulton made steam engines that could drive heavy machines such as flour mills, looms for weaving cloth, and trip hammers for forging iron. Men had long ago discovered that where there was a waterfall, or where you could build a dam and make a waterfall, you could build a water wheel under it and get power from mills and other machines. But you had to build your mill where there was a waterfall or a dam. A steam engine, though, that could be set up anywhere, even in the midst of a city, where there were plenty of workers to tend the machines. Up to that time, thread to make cloth had been spun with a distaff held in the hand or attached to a spinning wheel. This was fairly light work, so it was usually done by women and young girls, mostly by the girls, since the housewife had too much else to do. And that is why to this day we call an unmarried woman a spinster. But in the same year, 1769, in which Watt got a patent for his steam engine, an Englishman named Arkwright invented a rack to which you could attach a dozen or 100 distaffs and whirl them all at the same time, provided you had power enough to work it, and Watt's steam engine gave the power. Then, a country preacher, the Reverend Dr. Cartwright, invented a loom that could be worked by mechanical power instead of by hand. One weaver could work one loom, but a steam engine could work 100. And all the weaver had to do was to supply the loom with thread and retie any thread that broke. One weaver could do this for many looms. So, with the power machinery, one weaver could make many times as much cloth as he could when he had to work the thing himself. What happened in cloth making happened also in making nearly everything else that people use. But Watt's steam engine stayed in one place and was good only for working machinery. Not until 1815 did a man named Stephenson build an engine that could move itself and pull a wagon after it. Large numbers of people went to work to make Stephenson's locomotive better and bigger so it could pull more and more wagons faster and faster. The very first railroads were short bits of track built to haul heavy loads around the factories, but they soon began to extend out into the country and to haul anything people wanted moved. It is interesting to note that the first regular freight hauled by the first American railroad of this kind was firewood. It was brought to the city of Baltimore by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1828. This didn't happen all at once, and many years passed before most people realized that it was happening at all. They heard about the steam engine, and then the spinning jenny, and then the power loom, and then the locomotive, and they were interested. But the ordinary American couldn't see how these things were going to make much difference to him.